This is Chapter 16, Population and Global Inequality for Social Problems. Okay, so when you look at population in a global population increase by the numbers, most of the 83 million people that are being added to the world every year live in poor countries. But when you look back to about 2,000 years ago, the world's population was around 300 million people. And little changed until the Industrial Revolution, right? In 1800, we had the first billion that we reached for people. By 1930, that was up to 2 billion. By 1962, 3 billion. By 1974, 4 billion. By 1987, 5 billion. By 1999, 6 billion. By 2017, 7.5 billion. So we see that kind of exponential growth. So population was rising during the 19th century, as was the rate of increase. So again, this has a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution, right? As the Industrial Revolution kind of changed the way that we work, that we eat, that we live, and in many ways we were able to produce much more than we consume. So this kind of gave us the opportunity to stay more fixed in a place and be able to kind of increase populations. So like I said before, most of the 87 million people being added around the world every year live in poor countries where the problems of poverty are already serious. So this is why this is very problematic. Okay, so how do we study global population increases? So we're looking at the causes of population increase. So demography is just the study of the human population. It's these nerds that actually one of my bosses is a demographer, that they really try to study changes, patterns, and understandings of human populations, to kind of understand how they grow, how they change, or for instance, if you're interested in like immigration research, there's a lot of demographic variables there for people, whether they immigrate or emigrate, which again, every time you move to a new country, you are doing both. You're immigrating into the new country and you're emigrating, emigrating from the country that you came from. So some people study those factors of demography, but often the most common ones when it comes to population increases that we study are high fertility, low mortality, and infant mortality rates. So fertility is just the incidence of childbearing in a country's population. So one measure of society's fertility is the crude birth rate, which is the number of live births given each year for every 1,000 people in a population. So all other factors being equal, a higher nation's fertility, the faster the population is increasing. There's also low mortality, or what they call the crude death rate. That's the number of deaths in a given year per every 1,000 people in the population. So again, other factors being equal, the lower the mortality rate, the faster the population increases. So it makes sense if you have high fertility, lots of babies being born, and low mortality, lots of people living into old age, then you're going to have a lot more population increase. Because rich nations have populations that are on average much older, the death rates are higher than one might expect. And the infant mortality rate is the number of deaths among children under 1 year of age for every 1,000 live births. Infant mortality is a much better measure of a society's quality of life than the crude death rate. So the US rate is much higher than in most high-income countries, largely because we have greater social inequality in America than there is in a lot of other high-income countries. And really, the biggest factor is there's no universal health care within America, which there is in many other high-income nations, because without universal health care, only the wealthiest are able to get not just care for their babies and safe deliveries, but also prenatal care, right? So getting the right vitamins, getting the right checkups and treatments before you give birth that lead to better health outcomes for children. So it's a sad reality because of racial segregation, because of social class oppression, and all sorts of other factors, that a baby born in Detroit has less of a life expectancy than a baby born in Cuba, versus the life expectancies for a baby born in like Beverly Hills or Bel Air. Rich, affluent white communities have longer lifespans, right? So largely because of privilege. If you can afford healthcare, your baby's going to be healthier. So in countries that are high income nations where they just have universal healthcare, you're not only going to have the only healthy babies being the middle class and wealthier babies. You're going to have, everyone having access to that healthcare resource, which is incredibly important to how healthy babies are, right? So we know that because of, all of the structural inequalities that we have, especially the impact of institutionalized racism and sexism, really have an impact on who gets prenatal care and who doesn't. And of course, that affects their birth weights and then their baby's viability. Okay, moving on to global population increases. How do you measure all this stuff? So that was part of it, right? The infant mortality rate's a pretty good measure. But we also use the natural growth rate. So this is basically, it's based on variables of fertility and mortality, right? So births and deaths. So the world population is growing at the rate of 1.2% each year. And so to calculate the doubling time for a nation's population, you divide 70 by the growth rate, because you want to do this math at home. So another factor behind the growth of a nation is immigration, right? As people come into a country, that increases the amount of the population. Okay, so then going to the low growth north, the birth rate in Europe, the United States, and Canada is below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. So this results in what's called zero population growth, the level of reproduction that ends up maintaining a population at a steady rate. So for instance, if you are a couple and you have one child, that's actually negative population growth, because the idea is if you have two children, you're replacing each person with one child, because the idea is you get old and die, they live on, and that kind of keeps the population pretty steady. But if you have one kid for every couple, that's a negative population growth. So it's interesting when we think about, a zero population or negative population growths, we tend to think, there's just no one's having children. No, people are still having children under that model. They're just having far less children than in previous generations. So why is that? Why are people having less kids? Well, it's expensive as hell to raise a kid. That's part of it. Also, people now have legal access to contraception and abortion access so that they can choose, right, in a family planning sense, whether or not they want to have children or not and when they want to have children. Meaning, the overwhelming majority of people who have sought out an abortion actually already have children. So this idea is that sometimes we talk about and we really demonize abortion access in this country, but really it's about family planning and not having too many children than parents can financially provide for. Also, people are getting married later or staying single. So this has an impact on the population growth. And oftentimes, because of the economic inequality within the United States, both partners are working, and there's not a lot of family support for workers, such as paid family leave or any of those kind of supports. So as a result, both partners working in the workforce, it makes it very difficult to have kids, so they tend to have less children or no children at all. This is very different than the high growth South, right, where population growth is a serious problem for many poor people in poor nations. And so there are programs that have been implemented to try to decrease birth rates that do help with issues of population increase. But, most of the recent population increase is actually due to falling mortality, not an increase in births. So low-income countries are 82% of the planet's people. So if they have a lot of population increase, that's a lot of people, right? And almost all of this growth is in the Southern Hemisphere, in nations that have been previously colonized and controlled and had less opportunity to develop over time. So an important factor that's related to this, especially in the high growth South, is the social standing of women. So this is a key element in controlling world population growth. Give a woman more choices about how to live and she's going to have fewer kids, right? Give her access to contraceptives, whether it's birth control, condoms, or any other contraceptive use or abortion access, and she's going to end up having fewer children. So a woman who has access to schooling and jobs can also decide when and whether she wants to marry. right? And she can bear children by choice, not because it's the only option that's available to her, which is still the case in a lot of places around the world. Another way to understand or explain population increase is Malthusian theory, which we talked about a little bit in class. So this is based on Thomas Robert Malthus, who came up with this theory in the kind of like, basically he was doing this in a time period where industrial revolution was taking place. So he saw those changes take place in the 1800s, and he basically said that populations grow in geometric progression while food grows in arithmetic progression, meaning food, as many plants as you plant in the ground, that's how many you end up getting, or actually usually less than that, right? Like if you plant, 500 ears of corn or something, or 1,000 carrots or something like that, versus population growth is geometric or exponential, right? So let's say, if I have a partner and then I end up having, and again, remember the time period Malthusian was coming up with this stuff, or he was really, or Malthus, sorry, not Malthusian, Malthus, when he was coming up with this stuff, people were having like 12 kids as normal. So if you look at one couple and you say, okay, they're going to have 12 kids, and then each one of their 12 kids is going to partner off and have 12 kids, and then their 12 kids are going to have 12 kids, it's like, the troubles with tribbles, or like the reproduction of bunnies. It just happens so quickly. But that's also, again, Malthus was afraid that people would reproduce beyond what the planet could feed, leading to starvation and social chaos. But remember, Malthus lived in England in a time when population was beginning to soar. So his prediction that population would increase far more quickly than the supply of food and other resources really prompted some, kind of dystopian ideas about what the future would be like. But again, what's really interesting as a counter-argument to Malthus is the social standing of women. Meaning, if you give women choices, they're not going to have 12 kids. And as more people have access to healthcare and contraceptives, and where women have actual life and job opportunities and rights and autonomy to their own bodies, get to make choices of whether they have sex or not, that's integral to limiting population increase, right? Just treat women as people and give them power. Turns out they'll tell you if they want to have kids or not. All right, so a more recent approach than Malthus in like the 1800s is demographic transition theory. So this is a thesis that links demographic changes to a society's technological development. So basically, population is affected by 4 levels of technological development. In stage 1, you have pre-industrial societies that are associated with high birth rates, but also high death rates. Right? So there's very little or no growth because a lot of people are born, but a lot of people die. So this just means you're not getting the kind of medical interventions that are necessary. In stage 2, this is early industrial society. It's associated with onset of demographic transition. So high births, but declining deaths. So the early industrial time period when you're starting to get more technology, more comfort, so people can live longer, but people are still having a ton of babies. Then you get to stage 3, which is a mature industrial society. And this is associated with a decline in births and deaths. So it's just a slowdown in growth completely, right? Less people are being born, but also less people are dying. And then stage 4, in a post-industrial society like the United States, this is associated with low births and deaths. So little or no growth. Population pyramids are graphic representations of the population according to sex, and according to age. So the world's income and wealth is unequally divided among nations, obviously. The most serious problems of population increase and hunger are found in the same parts of the world. And in the book, they have this figure 16.4, which looks at population pyramids of Kenya, the United States, and Italy, and kind of compares them to each other. So again, it gives you a graphic representation of both sex and age. And so in poor nations such as Kenya, the youngest people make up the largest share of society, guaranteeing that population increase will continue as children enter their childbearing years. The US pyramid has more of a box-like shape because ours is on average a much older population, right? Those baby boomers, they're still around. On average, 10,000 people a day are retiring in this country. So that's a big demographic, part of this is that older generation. So this means the average age in the United States is about 38 compared to 20 in Kenya. And Italy is the other one in the same figure that's in your book. I think it's, yeah, figure 16.4, where Italy is one of the nations that records a slight population decrease because there are fewer younger people in Italy with a share of, and there are somewhat of a larger share of elderly people as well. So the average age there in Italy is actually 45, right, compared to 38 or 20. So that's also rising as well. So it's interesting, you can see as this kind of graphic representation of, how different those kind of populations are and the related factors to that. So when you look at high income nations, these are nations that have advanced technology, and so they have high productivity as a result of that. About 28% of the world's population, or 2.1 billion people, live in high income countries. And these are countries where the annual income's at least $19,000 or more. And people in these countries earn almost 60% of the world's income. When you look at middle income nations, these are industrialized nations that are also rural. About 47% of the population is rural within those countries. So their income ranges from about $3,500 to $15,000 a year. And about 60% of the world's population, or 4.3 billion people, live in middle-income countries such as India or China, where they are industrialized, but they do still have large rural populations. Overall, they earn about 38% of the world's income. While low-income nations, there are 48 low-income countries, and on average, they are mostly agrarian societies that are very poor, where over 65% of people live in rural areas. And most of these are in Central Africa or Asia, about 13% of the world's population, just under 1 billion people, and they are earning only 3% of the world's income. So looking at the world's poverty problem, about 850 million people in the world do not have enough food to eat. So undernourishment increases the risk of disease affecting and plaguing those groups of people. So there are just really long-term effects of poverty that are deadly. Global hunger is one of the most serious social problems in the world today. So kind of touching back on what Malthus said, we're not gonna have enough food to feed everyone. Is that true? Have we already passed that threshold? No. We feed more grain to livestock in the United States than we give out in world aid funding or resources. So we could easily, if we just stopped eating cows like today, we could just feed all that grain to people and effectively eliminate a lot of starvation. But that's not capitalistic, right? So you're not going to make a lot of money solving poverty or hunger. Which actually is not true, because in the long term, anyway, I'll just, back to the lecture, Carly. Okay, so really, it's interesting, this notion of relative versus absolute poverty. So relative poverty is when you lack resources that most take for granted in a society, right? So like the kind of poverty we have in the US, where you're poor, but you live indoors mostly, you might have a cell phone or a car, but they're just crappy, right? So relative poverty is you don't have a lot of the resources that other people do in your own country, versus absolute poverty is lack of resources that are life-threatening. Like you don't have enough food to survive, you don't have clothes, your life expectancy is incredibly low. And so what's interesting is this kind of affects a lot of the discussions of poverty within American society, as some conservatives will say, well, there's just relative poverty, right? Meaning, well, people still have air conditioning, so they can't be poor, even though they're living in like a motel, which is very different. You know, when you try to compare someone in American society to someone in the developing world, it's not a fair comparison. It's a very apples to oranges comparison, right? Just like absolute poverty and relative poverty are an apples to oranges comparison. So when we look at poverty in children, in low-income countries, 1/4 of all children lack the nutrition that they need to support their health. And so they end up living at the extreme edge of economic deprivation. And they often have little or no schooling, so that's not going to provide them with economic opportunities in their adulthood. And as a result of, their health being challenged, if you're not getting enough food, you have a much higher risk of disease. And also in a lot of these countries, because of less kind of social structure for children, there is a higher risk of violence as well. So For every dollar earned by an average person in the US, people in India earn about 10 cents. So even though India is now a middle income country, widespread poverty is still evident everywhere, right? And so if you were a visitor from the US, you would think, okay, wow, there's a lot of poverty here, but you would often not think about your particular role in engaging in a capitalistic global system that actually creates some of that inequality. Anywho, so looking at poverty in women, women are at a much higher risk of becoming, or getting trapped within poverty than men, largely because of patriarchal cultures where women have fewer choices, receive no education or limited schooling, and as a result, there's very little economic opportunities, right? You have to get married or have children because you don't have any legitimate opportunities to financially support yourself. And then, of course, the greatest horror linked to poverty is slavery. So we think of this as like, well, this was in the past and this was, a bad thing that happened in history. But in reality, this is still happening today, all around the world. There's, an estimated 20 million people right now working in forced labor of some kind. And there's another 168 million children that are child laborers, something that in this country, union rights movements fought against, child labor to make sure that children would instead be in school and would instead be able to enjoy that short period of time that is their childhood before they have to spend the rest of their damn life working, right? Like adults do. So in 1948, the United Nations issued a Universal Declaration of Human Rights saying that no one should be held in slavery or servitude, and that slavery and the slave trade will be prohibited in all forms. But the problem is that this is still happening, right? Whether it's, chattel slavery, which is, historically thought of as the kind of slavery that we had here in the United States, where one person owns another person. And this is the more modern version of this that's still happening is human trafficking, right? A very profitable form of crime where, people basically take people from other countries and, traffic them into the United States. There's people being trafficked all over the world, but what's interesting is we don't realize how many people in this country right now are working under forced labor, whether they're in some sort of domestic situation where they're expected to provide domestic labor within someone's home, where they're locked in at night, they have no resources or opportunities, and sometimes people are manipulated into these situations in human trafficking because they're told you're going to have job opportunities in this other place that you don't have here, but it becomes a form of indenture, basically, where you now owe this trafficker money that you're like, oh, you're supposed to work that off, but you never actually can. And so you just become completely indebted to this person. And so it's a very lucrative thing to force people to work within the garment industry. Like, for instance, the garment district in Los Angeles is filled with people that are in incredibly questionable human trafficking situations. You have people that are domestic labor in the same situations, but they're living in those like Brentwood, Bel Air homes, working 20 hours a day for some family, with no breaks, no retirement, no benefits of any kind, no health care, and really not a lot of formal mechanisms to make sure that they're actually being protected, like workers' rights. And so this is why Los Angeles has actually been working on this and has passed some stuff in recent years to specifically try to address domestic workers within its confines. But nationally, federally, there's really not that kind of support, and that's incredibly problematic. And then, of course, there's, child slavery, the idea of human trafficking for the purposes of sex, or, the sex market. So you have people that are trafficked into, prostitution and, often, again, taken from their families, or maybe their families sell them into these situations, and they end up, being trafficked because, again, it's a highly profitable market. And this is incredibly problematic around the world. There are areas that are known for their kind of sex tourism, where this features, victims of human trafficking who are either sold into these situations. Like there's this film I show in a couple of my other classes where, it's called Half the Sky, and it talks about all these issues that women face around the world. And one of them is, child prostitution, and how in some areas of the globe, the demand is getting younger and younger and younger. And so, children as young as 2, 3 years old are being trafficked into sex trafficking. And, they're horribly treated and abused. And there's this interesting, tidbit in that documentary. It's also a book called Half the Sky, but in the documentary, they go to this area in Bangladesh where this is happening. And it was really interesting. There's this woman who's an amazing, like, she herself was a survivor of sex trafficking. And, like, she was sold into the brothels as a child. And, she didn't know what was going to happen. She ended up breaking out and getting away years later. And what she ended up doing was founding an organization and eventually actually creating a home for all of these young women who were leaving these human trafficking situations. Because what happens is you're either stolen from your family or maybe sold. And so let's say you're stolen and you come back to your family like, I got free, like, thank God I'm home, And the family would often not want them there because of the stigma of, sex trafficking. The stigma of prostitution makes it that they're often not wanted. So a lot of these young kids, sometimes like little kids, 8, 9, 10, up to, usually teenagers, a lot of them being around 14 to 16 years old, they can't return home. They have nowhere to go. So that's how they kind of end up staying in the brothel system. And so this woman in the documentary, she created a home. She created a school, a place for them to live, all of these things because she knew that she didn't have anywhere to go when she got away, and she wanted to create that space for others. So what's interesting about the documentary Half the Sky, they talk a lot about all of these problems of global inequality, especially when it comes to patriarchal relations around the world. But what's so inspiring about the film is they show women in each country on the ground, in the community, that are actually doing something to address it, right? So I couldn't recommend the documentary more. Anyway, but of course, it's obviously heartbreaking. So another form of slavery is state-imposed slavery, where the government forces people to work as punishment or because it needs workers. So this is actually an interesting kind of thing. We talk about my crim class, racial caste systems over time. And Michelle Alexander argues in the book The New Jim Crow that in early racial caste system, the caste system of slavery, that after slavery ended, there was a need to still control people by race within this country. So what was slavery morphed and became Jim Crow segregation. But in the intervening years between Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation, you have this interesting situation of convict leasing, or what they call the black codes, like these weird laws that were like, you can't be in a place after sundown, or, all of these like vagrancy, like just these kind of vague charges that could be easily, loosely applied to people of color so that it was legally okay to beat them, lynch them, kill them. And so what's interesting is during this time period, you get convict leasing where someone would make eye contact with a white person and end up going to jail. And then the only way you could get through your jail time, it wasn't just a matter of like waiting in jail for time. You had to work it off on a farm. So what they call convict leasing, where they basically got more labor this way. And so this is right after slavery, and when the South really desperately needed labor because everyone was emancipated. So they would just come up with some fake charge for someone, put them in jail, and then force them to work again in slave-like conditions. So what's interesting is some people parallel this to the current day situation of what people get paid in prison for working. Like, for instance, in California, oftentimes when there's wildfires, you have people that are incarcerated on the front lines fighting those fires. And they pay them basically $1 an hour for risking their lives, standing in the front lines of, protecting the rest of us from these incredibly strong, incredibly terrifying wildfires. So some people argue, well, that is a state-imposed slavery, right? The fact that actually a lot of corporations benefit from prison labor because people are paid so little that corporations can make a ton of money off of this. Or in the case of California and using firefighters, the state saves millions of dollars not paying full firefighter wages, right? So here's the real problem with this, is people would say, well, they're still getting paid. Yeah, but they're often being coerced into doing this. Also, what they're getting paid is not at all commensurate with the person standing next to them that's making over $90,000 a year. Plus, it's the part where when they get out of jail, now that they have this skill and they could use that as a way to get a job as a firefighter, you can't if you have a felony. So it just basically doesn't actually provide a real opportunity for later. So kind of people parallel this back to convict leasing in the past, using people for this very cheap labor within prisons, which is incredibly exploited by corporations in America. You also have debt bondage, which is very common in sweatshops. And another form would be servile forms of marriage, right? Especially child brides, because again, they aren't choosing to get married at 10, 11, 12 years old. It's largely the result of living in a patriarchal society where their actions are controlled. Their parents arrange these things, and then they end up stuck in a situation with this old person that they're then forced to labor for. So when looking at theories of global inequality, structural functional analysis looks at the process of modernization. So modernization theory is just that model of economic and social development that explains global inequality in terms of technological and cultural differences between societies. So living standards increase in countries that experience industrialization, while in low-income countries there's less industrial technology, so a lot of people remain poor, and they also just don't have things like sometimes, electricity or running water, or things that are taken for granted in high-income countries. So tradition becomes a barrier to economic development, largely because people want to stay in that tradition and respect old ways. And that's kind of the first stage of what's considered, the stages of modernization theory by Rostow, is that people look to the past and they respect the old ways in the tradition stage and build their families and communities based on tradition. But once you hit the takeoff stage, stage 2 of modernization, people start to break free from tradition and pursue new types of work, kind of like what happened here during the Industrial Revolution. And stage 3 is then a drive to technological maturity, where poverty is then defined as a problem and technology is used as a solution to try to deal with this. And the ways of the past are then seen as old-fashioned instead of something we should stick to. And the fourth stage of this is obviously the one we're in, which is high mass consumption, which also results in widespread material affluence. So, some criticisms of modernization theory is that it's just simply defense of capitalism, right? So why is there so much poverty in the world if everything's being modernized? Also, rich nations often prevent poor nations from developing through colonization. So rich nations as a standard for the rest of the world also implies a very ethnocentric bias to our understanding. So the theory implies that poor societies are kind of responsible for their own poverty. Versus social conflict analysis is looking at the global economic system. So you have world systems theory. That's a model of economic development that explains global inequality in terms of historical exploitation of poor societies by rich societies. So rich nations have exploited poor nations. They became rich only because others became poor, right? So colonization is really, or this colonialism, is the process by which some nations enrich themselves through political and economic control of other countries. And nowadays we have a new form of economic exploitation that's neo-colonialism, which involves the operation of multinational corporations rather than direct political control by foreign governments. So now it's a company that, the transnational corporation that is causing a lot of that kind of colonialism and expansion. So this leads really into Wallerstein's arguments about the capitalist world economy, what he called dependence theory, which is that the world economy exploits people living in poor nations and makes low-income countries dependent on rich nations, right? So poor countries have only narrow export-oriented economies. They lack industrial production, so they're deeply in debt, largely because they're forced by the IMF and World Bank into these kind of larger agreements so that they can still trade and have some sort of commerce exchange with high-income countries. So they're often deeply in debt to the rich nations because the rich nations make the agreement. So it's starting out on an uneven playing field and then making the playing field even more uneven. So the global economy is overdeveloped rich nations and incredibly underdeveloped the rest of the world. So looking at constructing problems and defining solutions, conservatives say that we should look to the power of the market. That capitalism is a great productive power, and that modernization is the solution to global poverty, that things are getting better. While liberals would say the government's got to act, right? Remember, liberals, all it means to be a liberal is that you think that change should happen at the government level, right? So creating a law to change something, that's where liberal comes from. So they argue that the market system is productive, but it's not the only solution to global poverty. And that the market system, along with government programs that address inequality, will help poor nations move out of poverty, right? So sure, use some capitalism, but also use some kind of social welfare opportunities so that, people can basically be lifted out of poverty. So they also argue that rich nations have a moral obligation to help poor nations and eliminate the exploitation, because that's where they got their money from. That's where they got their power and wealth and resources from, was from these poor nations. So it's time for them to pay up, right? And to help support the development in those places. And that, families should have the opportunity to own land and to be able to kind of make their own way in this global economy. While the radical left think that the best solution is to end global capitalism completely. So it's consistent with world systems theory, right? That, poverty is not inevitable. It's a choice, right? Like, so going back to that example I gave before, the world produces enough food to feed everybody, for sure, easily. Actually, fun fact is that when it comes to produce in the U.S., 40% of the produce in the U.S. is just thrown away. Not because it's bad, mostly because it's ugly. Like, someone doesn't want to eat a carrot that's all kind of weird, right? That's actually why we have baby carrots, because this guy was like losing a ton of money trying to sell his ugly ass carrots, and then he realized if you just shaved them down, these weird little nubs, people would like that and eat those, even though it's like an incredibly wasteful process. So anyway, it's not a situation of like, oh, there's not enough food for everybody. It's just the people that have so much food, like the United States, the incredibly wealthy countries, just don't really care about those other countries and will literally throw away almost half of what they produce just because, while kind of decrying, oh no, I wonder why all these people are starving, and not realizing that, if the goal was to end starvation, we could do that. We could do that right now. But that's not what's happening. Why? Because how do you get rich ending starvation? You don't, right? It's kind of like what's going on, in the context of COVID with vaccine manufacturers, that they want to keep their patents, they want to make money off of it. And poor and developing countries that have had no access to vaccines are saying, please, let us create generic versions of these things so that people can stop dying. But there's no money in that. Where's the money in it? So that's kind of what the radical left is saying, is that poverty is not inevitable. It's our choices. And so they argue that the solution to global poverty is, one of global democracy, basically empowering poor people of the world so that they actually have some opportunities and resources.